I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low behind the pines and casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, sharp and almost sweet. The cabin itself was small and wooden, its dark brown planks warped slightly from years of weather. It looked abandoned, the windows streaked and the door hanging slightly off its hinges. Part of me hesitated, my instincts warning me that this place hadn't seen much company in a long time. But the isolation was exactly what I had wanted. I needed time away from everything: phones, work, people, noise. Just me and the woods. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the cold. Not just the air, which was biting, but a strange, deep chill that seemed to seep from the floorboards themselves. The cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke, like someone had left it in a hurry decades ago and never returned. Dust floated in the air in thin streaks, catching the light from the one small window in the living area. The furniture was minimal: a wooden table with one chair, a rickety bed against the far wall, and a stove that looked functional but hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag by the door and walked around, touching the walls and running my fingers along the cracked wood. Everything felt fragile, like it could crumble under the slightest pressure. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, sending a low, constant groan through the cabin. I tried to focus on setting up, lighting the small lantern I had brought, unpacking my supplies. But the noises from outside seemed to grow louder as darkness fell, each snap of a branch and rustle of leaves sharp against the quiet. By nightfall, the forest was a solid wall of black outside the windows. I could hear the distant call of an owl and the faint rustling of what I assumed were small animals. The wind had picked up, rattling the loose boards and making the cabin creak like it had a life of its own. I tried to brush off the unease, telling myself I was just tired, that it was normal for old buildings to make noises. But the feeling of being watched, the gnawing at the edge of my mind, didn't go away. Around midnight I heard it. A sharp, deliberate knock on the cabin door. My heart stopped. At first I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again. 3 quick knocks, slow and heavy. My mind raced. There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. The road was miles away, and the cabin wasn't listed on any public map. I froze, listening. Silence followed, but it was thick, almost suffocating. I debated opening the door, debating running out into the dark forest, debating calling someone, but my phone had no signal. The next few hours were a blur of anxiety. Every little sound: the shift of the bed as I moved, the creak of the door swinging on its hinges, the groan of a tree bending in the wind made me jump. I tried to sleep, curling under the thin blanket I had brought, but my mind refused to quiet. I kept thinking about the knocks, about someone possibly watching me from outside, maybe hiding in the shadows. The rational part of me knew it was probably an animal, maybe a falling branch, but the fear felt real, physical. Morning brought little relief. The sunlight streaming through the window didn't feel comforting. It was harsh, highlighting the gaps in the walls, the dirt on the floor, the way the shadows moved oddly across the room. I decided to leave, to get back to the road and head home. But when I opened the door, the forest seemed different. The path I had walked in on was no longer clear, the trees closer, the underbrush thicker, almost as if it had grown overnight. Panic clawed at me, and I realized I had no idea which way to go. The cabin, which had seemed small and manageable, now felt like a trap. I spent the day trying to find the road, moving cautiously through the trees, listening for the sounds of civilization. Nothing. Just the wind, the occasional bird, and the unshakable feeling that something was wrong. By late afternoon I was exhausted, my legs scraped and bruised from branches and rocks. I stumbled upon a small stream and decided to follow it, reasoning that water eventually led somewhere people might be. The forest around me was dense, tangled, and unfamiliar. Every sound made me startle: the splash of a fish, the snap of a branch, even the whisper of the wind through leaves. As night fell again, I found a slightly elevated spot near the stream and decided to spend the night there. I gathered dry leaves and twigs, managed to light a small fire, and huddled next to it, shivering. The forest at night was alive with sounds, many of them unfamiliar. I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself that humans had survived in places like this for centuries. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The second night was harder. I stayed awake most of the time, staring into the fire, listening. At one point I thought I heard voices, low and indistinct, but the wind could have easily created them. My mind was stretched thin, fear fraying the edges of my reason. I wondered if I would ever find the road again, if anyone would notice I was missing, if I would just wander forever. The next morning something changed. I woke to a soft, steady sound, a truck, far off but unmistakable. Hope surged through me. I followed the sound carefully, moving toward it, using the sun to guide me. Hours passed, and just when I felt I couldn't keep going, I saw the road. A thin, dusty path cutting through the trees, exactly where it had been when I arrived. I ran, stumbling, crying, but running. Soon I saw the truck again, and the driver, noticing me, slowed and pulled over. Relief hit me like a wave. I explained as best I could, still shaking, my voice hoarse. The driver didn't ask many questions, just gave me water and a blanket, letting me catch my breath. Back in my car, driving away from the cabin, the forest behind me looked calm, even beautiful. The terror and panic of the past 2 nights felt almost unreal in comparison to the sunlight and the road. I realized that the fear I had felt wasn't from anything supernatural, it was the isolation, the uncertainty, the way the human mind reacts when it has no control over its environment. The cabin, the forest, the wind, they weren't out to get me. But they had shown me something about myself. How easily fear can take root, how small mistakes or assumptions can escalate, and how important it is to prepare and respect nature. I stopped at a diner a few miles down the road, ordered coffee, and finally let myself relax. The experience had shaken me, yes, but it had also taught me a kind of clarity. I knew I wouldn't go back to that cabin, not alone, not without proper preparation. But I also knew I could survive fear, survive isolation, and find my way out of a situation that seemed hopeless. The road ahead looked normal and safe, but I would carry the memory of the cabin and the forest with me forever, a reminder that survival is as much about mental strength as it is about physical endurance. By the time I reached my apartment, I was exhausted but calm. I unpacked my things, checked my phone, and saw the missed calls and worried messages from friends and family. I called them, reassuring them, and for the first time in 2 days, I slept without fear. The cabin remained out there, silent and empty, but it no longer held power over me. I had faced the unknown and come back. I had survived, and that was enough. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It looked like it had been swallowed by the woods. I had been driving for hours down a narrow, winding dirt road, the kind where the sun disappears between thick trees, and the only sound is the tires crunching over fallen leaves. The cabin was small, made of old, weathered logs, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, as if it had given up holding itself up long ago. There was a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, though I had no idea if anyone lived there. My plan had been simple. Stay the weekend alone, disconnect from everything, read, hike, and maybe take some pictures. I wanted the quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the world has paused just for you. The first few hours were calm. I unpacked my small bag, filled the old metal kettle with water from the pump outside, and lit the fireplace. The cabin smelled of damp wood and earth, and dust motes floated in the sunlight that came through the cracks in the window panes. I could hear birds in the distance and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. It was exactly the escape I had been looking for. But as the day stretched into evening, the quiet became heavier. I had walked around the property, taking pictures of the overgrown garden and the moss-covered stones that probably had been part of a walkway. Every step on the wooden porch creaked, echoing against the surrounding forest. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed the darkness didn't just fall, it swallowed. The woods became a black wall, and the air seemed colder and sharper. I lit the small oil lamp I had brought with me. Its light barely reached the far corners of the cabin, and I realized the shadows seemed to gather in places where the lamp didn't touch. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I started noticing little things. The front door, which I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. My heart jumped, but I rationalized. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly. I tightened the lock again and checked the windows. Everything seemed fine. I sat down by the fireplace, trying to focus on the book I had brought. But the forest outside didn't feel alive anymore, it felt like it was watching. Every little noise, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves, made me tense up. I convinced myself it was animals, maybe deer or raccoons. Still, every time the wind pushed through the trees, it sounded almost like someone walking. Night came fully, and I realized I hadn't checked my phone in hours. I dug it out of my bag, but there was no signal. No texts, no calls, nothing. Even the GPS was blank. I told myself it didn't matter. I had wanted to get away from technology anyway. I went to sleep on the old mattress in the loft, hearing the occasional pop of the firewood in the fireplace. I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint, like a soft dragging coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was a tree branch scraping the wall in the wind, but the sound was deliberate. Slow, consistent, moving around the cabin. I froze, listening, my mind trying to make sense of it. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop, a low, steady knocking at the back door. Not loud, just enough to be noticeable, repeated 3 times, then silence. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, telling myself it was nothing. I knew rationally it could have been an animal, a bear maybe, or a raccoon, but my body refused to calm down. Eventually, the sounds stopped and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to check the cabin perimeter. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night had been windy and I could see footprints in the soft soil near the back of the cabin. But they weren't animal prints. They were boots. Human boots. And they led away from the cabin into the forest. My first instinct was to panic, but then I realized panicking wouldn't help. I stayed calm, taking photos of the prints in case I needed evidence later. I spent the day trying to keep busy. I cleaned up some cobwebs inside the cabin, collected firewood, and even tried to ignore the unease growing in my chest. By afternoon, the sun was lower and shadows stretched long across the cabin floor. I noticed small details I had missed before. The lock on the front door was scratched and the back door had marks like something had been trying to force it open. My hands shook slightly as I bolted it again and wedged a chair under the handle for extra security. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound made me tense. I kept imagining someone out there hiding behind the trees, waiting. At one point, I saw movement through the window, a figure at the edge of the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. My rational brain told me it was the wind, my tired eyes, anything but someone. But the fear had rooted itself deep inside me. By the morning, I decided I wouldn't wait for anything else to happen. I packed quickly, stuffing my bag with essentials, double-checking that nothing was left behind. I wanted to leave before it got worse, before someone actually tried to come near the cabin again. I stepped outside, scanning the forest, and saw fresh tracks in the mud near the porch, smaller than the boots, almost like someone had been crouching. I swallowed hard, heart racing, and started walking back to my car. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. Nothing. Just the forest, silent again, but I didn't trust it. When I finally reached the dirt road and started the engine, relief washed over me. I drove slowly at first, looking in the rearview mirror constantly, until I hit a section of the road where I could see the cabin disappearing behind me. I realized how isolated I had been, how easy it would have been for someone to watch me, to wait. My hands were sweaty, gripping the steering wheel, and my stomach was tight with fear and adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in a small town miles away. I went inside, using the payphone to call a friend, just needing to hear a familiar voice. I told myself over and over that I would never go back to that cabin. I stayed in the town for the night, sleeping in a motel, the kind of sleep where you wake up a few times but feel safer than you have in days. A week later, I looked up the cabin online. It was listed for rent, supposedly abandoned for years except for the occasional caretaker. But I knew what I had seen. Footprints, marks, noises. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching. I reported the incident to the local authorities, who said they would check the area, though they weren't optimistic. The memory of that weekend stays with me. I still think about the sound of dragging, the scratches on the door, and the feeling of being watched. But I also remember how I managed it. I stayed alert, I documented everything, and I trusted my instincts. It was terrifying, yes, but I made it out safely. I left the cabin behind, but I carry the lessons with me. In the woods, you can't always rely on your imagination to scare you. Sometimes the danger is very real. Even now, years later, I avoid isolated cabins in the woods. But whenever I drive past a dirt road with dense trees, I remember that weekend vividly. The fear was intense, but it was real, and I survived because I stayed aware, stayed calm, and didn't wait for help that might never have come. That weekend in the cabin taught me more about danger, intuition, and survival than any story or warning ever could. I had always loved being alone in the woods. The idea of escaping the noise of the city, the constant hum of cars, and the chatter of people appealed to me more than anything. When I found the small cabin tucked deep in the forest online, it seemed perfect. It was old but sturdy, with a wooden porch that overlooked a small, mist-covered pond. The photos made it look peaceful and quiet, exactly what I wanted. I didn't care that there were no neighbors for miles, no cell signal, and no real emergency services nearby. I thought it would be liberating. I was wrong. The first day was everything I hoped it would be. I drove through narrow dirt roads lined with tall pine trees, the smell of wet earth filling the car. The sun was bright, but the forest cast long, twisting shadows across the path, making it feel like I was entering another world. When I finally reached the cabin, the wooden structure looked more worn than it had in the photos. The paint was peeling and some of the boards on the porch were cracked. But it felt real, untouched, and perfect for being alone. I dropped my bag inside, unlocked the windows to let the fresh air in, and spent the day exploring the small clearing around the cabin. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, insects buzzing, and the rustle of something moving far off in the trees. At first I thought it was just deer or squirrels, but there was a stiffness to the sounds, a timing that made me pause. Every now and then, I would catch glimpses of movement between the trunks of the trees, fleeting shadows that vanished when I tried to focus on them. I shook it off, blaming my imagination and the long drive. That night, I lit the fireplace and cooked a simple dinner. The wood smelled smoky, comforting, and warm. Outside, the wind started picking up, rattling the windows. The sky was cloudy, hiding the moon, and the forest seemed to lean closer to the cabin, pressing against the walls. I tried to read a book to distract myself, but I kept glancing at the window, feeling watched, though I knew logically no one could be out there. Around midnight, I went to bed. The cabin had one small bedroom with an old mattress that creaked when I moved. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listening to the wind, trying to convince myself it was just the storm that had started to blow in. But then I heard something else, soft, deliberate, scraping noises coming from the porch. At first, I thought maybe the wind was catching on the wood, but it was different this time. Slow, controlled, like someone was running a stick along the edge of the porch railing. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities. Deer or raccoons could get up there, couldn't they? But this sound had a rhythm, a persistence that made it feel human. My phone was dead, no signal, no charger long enough to reach the bed. I wanted to ignore it, but I couldn't. The scraping stopped for a moment and then it started again, moving from the corner of the porch to the stairs. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, trying to calm down. I told myself it had to be an animal. Still, I grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and pointed it toward the window. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing at first. Then I saw it. A shadow larger than a deer, crouched by the stairs, just beyond the edge of the porch. It was still, waiting. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. The shadow shifted slightly and then darted into the woods, disappearing completely. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. The wind seemed to grow louder, almost masking footsteps that might have been coming closer to the cabin. The scraping returned once, twice, each time closer than before. I tried to convince myself it was branches falling in the wind, but I knew better. Something had been here outside my cabin, moving deliberately, testing the boundaries. The next morning, I didn't sleep well, but I forced myself to get up. The sun was breaking through the clouds, casting weak light over the wet forest. I wanted to leave immediately, but the car was parked a mile down the dirt road, and the thought of going out there alone made my stomach twist. I decided to stay, reasoning that daylight made everything feel safer. I spent the morning inspecting the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place inside, doors locked, windows intact, no sign of anyone entering. But when I went outside to check the porch, I found it. Small scratches along the wooden steps, deep enough to make me recoil. They weren't random. They were deliberate, almost like someone had been dragging something heavy across them. Panic set in again. I checked the trees around the cabin, scanning for footprints, anything that would explain it, but the ground was soft and muddy and no tracks were visible. Whoever had been there must have left in a hurry, covering their tracks. I tried to keep busy, chopping wood, filling the fireplace, boiling water. Every noise outside made me jump. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt alive in a way that was hostile and aware of me. I stopped going near the edges of the clearing, staying close to the cabin. Night approached faster than I expected, the wind picking up again. I tried to convince myself to stay calm, but when the scraping started again, I didn't even try to look. I just stayed frozen, clutching the flashlight, listening to it move across the porch, along the railing, down the steps. Then it stopped. Complete silence. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. Then a sound that I can only describe as a shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the wet ground, coming from the side of the cabin I hadn't been watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, and without thinking I bolted to the bedroom, grabbed my bag and stuffed my phone, charger and some snacks inside. I didn't stop to look outside. I just ran, heart pounding, adrenaline screaming in my ears, down the muddy path to my car. I reached it just as the last light faded from the sky. Hands shaking, I fumbled with the keys and finally the engine roared to life. I didn't even check mirrors or surroundings. I drove down the dirt road as fast as I could, headlights cutting through the darkness, listening for anything following me. Behind me, the trees loomed like they were alive, and every shadow made me flinch. When I finally reached a paved road and saw the lights of a small town in the distance, I slowed down. Relief washed over me in waves, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. I parked at a gas station, leaving the car running, and sat there for a long time trying to convince myself it was over. I called my friend, explaining as much as I could without sobbing into the phone. They insisted I stay put until someone could come for me. The next day, I returned to the cabin with a local sheriff. He looked at the scratches on the porch and the surrounding woods, then frowned. "Looks like someone's been watching it, maybe squatting nearby," he said. "They run from people during the day, come back at night. You were lucky to get out when you did." I realized then that the shadow I had seen wasn't an animal. It was a person, maybe more than one. Someone had been living near the cabin, hiding in the woods, and they were careful, methodical, and patient. I never went back. Even months later, I could remember the scraping, the way the shadow crouched near the porch, the cold weight of fear pressing down on me in that silent forest. I didn't tell anyone the full story at first because it sounded ridiculous. A shadow in the woods, scratches on a porch? People assume you imagined it. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know I got lucky that night. Now, whenever I drive through a forest, even in daylight, I notice the trees differently. I notice shadows that move too deliberately, shapes that pause and watch, the way the forest seems almost aware. I keep a flashlight in my bag at all times, a small, stupid thing that feels necessary even in towns. The cabin was supposed to be an escape, a place to find peace. Instead, it taught me something I can't unlearn. Being alone in the woods is not the same as being safe. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the sound of scraping on wood, slow, deliberate, testing boundaries, and I remember the feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was just outside, hidden in the dark, waiting to see what I would do next. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape from the city, a place where the forest would swallow me whole and I could forget deadlines, noise, and people. It was small, made of dark wood that had seen decades of snow and rain. I remember the first time I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and the smell of damp pine and old wood filling my nose. Everything felt heavy, like the walls themselves were holding on to years of secrets. I had arrived in the late afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, clouds hanging low over the treetops, making the forest look more like a shadowed ocean than a collection of trees. I had parked the car on a dirt path that led almost invisibly to the cabin. There was no cell phone signal, which I initially thought was perfect. No calls, no notifications, just me and the endless rhythm of the forest. Inside, the cabin had a small kitchen with a rusty stove, a single sink, and a wooden table scarred with knife marks and rings from old cups. I dropped my bag and walked through the main room, noticing the fireplace, blackened from years of fires. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, but I didn't care. I set up my things, lit a small lantern, and unpacked. The first night passed in quiet unease. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every gust of wind against the windows sounded too deliberate. But I told myself it was normal. Old cabins were always noisy. The forest wasn't dangerous. It was just trees and animals. The next morning I went to explore. The forest around the cabin was dense, the path narrow and littered with pine needles. I could barely see the sky through the branches. There were signs of wildlife tracks in the mud, claw marks on trees, but nothing threatening. Still, there was a feeling, subtle but undeniable, that I was being watched. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination. By the second night, things began to feel off. I had started a fire in the fireplace, the crackling flames offering a strange comfort. But the wind had shifted and I could hear it moving differently, almost like it was whispering through the trees. At first I thought it was just the branches rubbing together, but then I noticed other sounds. Small thumps on the roof, soft scratches on the side of the cabin. Not heavy enough to be an animal, I told myself, but persistent enough to make me uneasy. I tried to distract myself. I made dinner on the stove, the smell of soup filling the cabin. I read a book, hoping the words would ground me. But every so often the floorboards would creak in a way that sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart would spike and I'd stop breathing until the sound faded. On the third day I decided to go further into the forest. I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was out there, that I wasn't losing my mind. I packed water and snacks, taking the narrowest trail I could find. Hours passed as I walked, the forest becoming increasingly dense. The light dimmed under the canopy, turning everything a deep green gray. And then I heard it, the sound of someone moving through the brush behind me. I froze. The sound wasn't consistent like an animal. It had weight, like a person trying not to be noticed. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead. I turned slowly, but the trees were thick. I couldn't see anyone. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer. Panic rose in my chest. I broke into a run, the undergrowth whipping against my legs, roots trying to trip me. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My hands shook as I tried to calm down, telling myself I had just imagined it, that maybe it was a deer or some other animal. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Something had followed me. That night was the worst. Every sound was magnified, the wind, the branches, the roof creaking under the weight of snow or ice. I wasn't sure which. And then I heard it again. Scratching, low and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My entire body was rigid and I felt the seconds stretch into hours. At some point I realized the sound had stopped. I exhaled slowly, convincing myself I had survived, that maybe it was gone. I finally crawled into bed, clutching a blanket like it could protect me. The next day I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped everything. I told myself the moment I reached the car I'd leave and never look back. I kept an eye on the forest, noticing things I hadn't before: broken branches near the cabin, footprints that weren't mine, subtle signs that someone had been close. The walk back to the car was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me jump, my pulse hammering in my ears. I kept my eyes on the path, moving as fast as I could without tripping. When I finally saw the car, relief crashed over me in a wave I couldn't contain. I ran the last few steps, throwing myself inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone running behind me. The forest was silent again, just trees and shadows. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. The road twisted and turned, and with every mile, the cabin faded behind me. Eventually, I reached a gas station. The bright lights felt surreal after the darkness of the forest. I bought water, tried to calm myself, and finally called my friend to tell her I was okay. My voice shook so badly I almost couldn't speak. But I made it, and I promised myself I wouldn't go back. In the weeks after, I thought about the cabin constantly. I wondered who or what had been there and why it had followed me. I imagined scenarios, but none of them made sense. The forest could hide people, sure, but it felt deliberate, like someone had been watching me for days, waiting. I tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. Eventually, life returned to normal. The memory of the forest became something I carried quietly, a reminder of how fragile safety can be. I never went back to cabins alone. I never took solitary trips into dense forests. But I also learned something about myself. That fear can sharpen your instincts, can save you if you pay attention. And I had survived. It wasn't a fairy tale, and nothing supernatural had saved me. There were no ghosts, no magical creatures, just the weight of human presence and the unpredictability of the forest. That was what made it terrifying. I had faced something real, something that could have ended badly if I hadn't been alert, and I had made it through. Years later, I still remember the smell of the cabin, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the scraping against the walls. I remember the panic, the adrenaline, the pure instinct to survive. And I also remember the relief, the safety of the car, the lights of the gas station, and the knowledge that I had escaped, fully alive, fully aware, and stronger for it. Some places are meant to be left alone. Some experiences are meant to teach you caution. And some fears, the ones that are real and immediate, the ones that make your heart pound and your hands shake, are the ones that teach you more about yourself than any happy ending ever could. I had learned that lesson the hard way. I drove down the winding dirt road for what felt like hours, the winter sun hanging low behind the trees, making long shadows stretch across the path. The GPS signal kept cutting in and out, so I had to rely on the faint directions printed on a small sheet of paper I found in the cabin rental email. It was supposed to be remote, and that was part of the appeal. No city noise, just the woods, snow and silence. I wanted solitude, a break from everything, a place to breathe. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, more isolated than I expected. It was old but sturdy, made of dark logs that had weathered decades of storms. Smoke rose lazily from the stone chimney, curling into the gray sky. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out, dragging my suitcase behind me. I noticed the lock on the front door was old, but the key fit perfectly. Inside, the smell of wood polish and something faintly earthy made me feel both uneasy and oddly comforted. The main room was modest. A stone fireplace, a wooden dining table, a small kitchenette, and a stairway leading to a loft above. Sunlight from the single window barely lit the room, giving everything a muted yellow-brown tone. After dropping my bags, I unpacked quickly, setting up my laptop on the table so I could keep some semblance of work going while I was here. The silence outside was deep. Not the kind of comforting quiet you find in a library, but heavy, almost pressing. The wind whispered through the trees, and the old roof groaned every so often, like it was settling in for the night. By mid-afternoon, I decided to explore. The snow was soft and wet under my boots, leaving uneven prints behind me as I walked down a narrow path that led away from the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees tall and skeletal, stripped of leaves, and their branches seemed to claw at the sky. As I walked, I felt an odd awareness, like the woods were watching me, but when I turned, nothing was there. Just trees and the dull gray of winter. I returned to the cabin as the light started to fade. The inside felt colder than outside, a damp chill that settled in my bones despite the small heater humming in the corner. I lit a few candles for warmth and atmosphere, watching the shadows dance across the walls. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation getting to me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Night came faster than I expected. The temperature dropped, frosting the windows with thin layers of ice. I tried reading, tried listening to music, anything to drown out the growing sense of unease. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound at the back of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. It was slow, deliberate, like nails dragged across wood. My heart jumped, but I convinced myself it was just a branch brushing the siding, something natural. I kept busy, checking the windows, ensuring they were locked, pulling the curtains tight. Then, as I went to turn off the lights and settle into bed, the sound returned, closer this time. It was coming from the kitchen. I gripped the flashlight I'd brought with me, hesitating before stepping down the stairs. The kitchen was empty. The light from my flashlight bounced off the cabinets, the table, the old stone floor. Nothing. But when I stepped closer to the window that looked out into the yard, I saw footprints in the snow. Heavy, distinct prints leading up to the side of the cabin and then stopping abruptly. My stomach sank. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been outside, and they had been close enough to touch the walls. I checked the doors and windows again, pressing my body against them, listening. Then I noticed something even worse. The back door, the one with the old deadbolt, was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think clearly. I pushed the door open slowly. Outside, the snow had been disturbed. There were no signs of anyone now, but it was clear someone had been here recently. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, flashlight and phone in hand. I couldn't sleep. Every sound, the wind, the creaking wood, a distant animal, made me jump. I kept replaying the footprints, the open door, the scraping. I thought about calling the police, but I was in the middle of nowhere. Help would take at least an hour, maybe more. I had to handle this myself. The next morning, I didn't wait to think. I packed my essentials, phone, wallet, keys, and the flashlight, and made my way back to the road. The snow had fallen again overnight, erasing the footprints. From the road, I could see the outline of a few tracks leading into the woods. I didn't look closer. I walked fast, crunching through the snow, listening for anything behind me. It was hours before I reached a gas station where someone could call for help. The clerk was sympathetic but cautious. I explained what happened, showed the tracks in the snow, and described the cabin. He made a call and told me the authorities would check it, but he warned me that in that area, it wasn't unusual for people to hide in abandoned or rented cabins. When the local officers arrived at the cabin a few hours later, they found evidence that someone had indeed broken in and had been living there, using the abandoned rental as a temporary shelter. There were makeshift bedding, empty cans, and signs of cooking. They reassured me that the person was no longer there and that the cabin would be secured. I spent the night at a nearby motel, exhausted but safe. I couldn't stop thinking about how close it had been, how easy it could have turned into something much worse. I realized that my desire for isolation had blinded me to the risks, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. I had faced a real fear, not a supernatural one, and survived it. I learned to trust my instincts and my awareness. A few weeks later, I returned to the area, not to the cabin, but to the town nearby to settle some paperwork with the rental company. They had closed the cabin indefinitely, and I could see that someone else might have come across it in the future. I made sure they understood the importance of security, especially in remote places. The memory of that night stayed with me, a reminder that danger often doesn't need a ghost, just opportunity and isolation. After that experience, I changed the way I approached adventures. I researched locations carefully, always had backup plans, and kept communication open. I didn't lose my love for the woods, the snow, or quiet solitude, but I learned that respect for the environment includes respect for potential dangers, human and natural alike. And sometimes, just sometimes, knowing how to get yourself safely out is the most important part of the adventure. Even now, whenever I see a cabin in the woods, my pulse quickens for a moment, but then I smile. I know I survived something real. I know I can handle the unexpected. And that knowledge, more than anything, keeps me calm even when the wind whispers through the trees and the snow falls softly, erasing the tracks behind me. I had been driving for hours through winding, barely marked roads that twisted through thick pine forests. My phone had no signal, and the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. I wasn't supposed to be out here this late, but the directions to the cabin had seemed straightforward in the daylight. Now everything felt different, harder to read, more isolated. The gravel road crunched under my tires, and I kept glancing into the dark woods that pressed close on either side, the shadows stretching like long fingers. The cabin finally appeared, a small wooden structure tucked into a clearing. It looked almost abandoned, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was just nerves. I'd been coming out here to get away from the city, to write in peace, and I wasn't going to let the eerie vibe stop me. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of damp pine and moss, and the soft rustle of leaves sounded like whispers. Inside, the cabin was dusty and smelled faintly of mold and old wood. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the furniture was rough and worn. I set my bag down on the floor and flicked on the small, battery-powered lantern I had brought, the soft glow revealing the kitchen, a small living area, and a narrow staircase leading to the loft bedroom. There was no electricity, no running water, just me, the cabin, and the dense woods outside. I should have felt a sense of calm, the isolation I had come for, but instead, there was a gnawing unease in my chest, like I wasn't alone. I unpacked my things slowly, trying to focus on the little routines, laying out my notebook, checking my supplies, making tea on the small camping stove I had brought. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. At first it sounded normal, but then I realized it wasn't the wind, it was something scratching against the siding, low and deliberate. My heart jumped. I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen shelf and pressed myself against the wall, listening. The scratching stopped, leaving only the creaking of the cabin settling and the occasional snap of a branch. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer brushing past, but the hair on my arms refused to lie down. Night fell quickly. I lit a few candles and sat at the small wooden table trying to write, but my hands kept trembling. Every small sound, the groan of the old floorboards, the rustle of leaves, made me jump. I told myself I was imagining things. The cabin was old, the woods were alive with animals, and I was alone. That was it. I focused on the soft scratch of pen on paper, trying to drown out the fear creeping in. Hours later, I went to the loft to sleep. The stairs were narrow and steep, and I climbed carefully, still holding the pan. The loft was tiny, just enough space for a mattress. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and lay on my back, staring at the ceiling. The wind had died down, and I tried to convince myself that I was safe. But then I heard it again, this time, It was a low thud from somewhere outside, followed by a faint crunch of gravel. My stomach dropped. Someone was out there. I stayed frozen, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving the night silent except for my own ragged breathing. My mind raced through scenarios: someone lost, a camper, or worse, someone watching me. I realized then that the cabin had no locks, only a simple wooden latch on the door. Panic clawed at me. I decided to stay put until daylight, hiding every sharp object I could reach. I didn't sleep. I kept my eyes open, listening to every creak, every whisper of movement outside. Around midnight, a shadow appeared at the window. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might be heard outside. I held my breath, straining to see. It didn't move. It didn't do anything. And then it disappeared. I couldn't tell if it had been a trick of the candlelight or something else. My mind refused to reason it was real, I told myself, and I had to be ready. Morning came slowly. Pale light filtered through the grimy windows, and the woods looked less threatening in daylight, but I didn't feel safe yet. I packed some essentials into my backpack: water, snacks, a flashlight, and decided I would leave. I checked the cabin thoroughly, looking for anything out of place. The door had scratches on the outside frame, deep ones like something had been clawing at it. My hands shook, but I tried to stay calm. I had to get to a road with signal. The walk back to the gravel road felt endless. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept thinking I saw movement in the corner of my eyes, shadows between the trees, but when I turned there was nothing. Hours passed, though I couldn't tell exactly how long. I kept moving, forcing myself not to stop. And then I saw it, a figure standing far in the clearing ahead, watching me. I froze, trying to figure out if it was real. It didn't move, didn't even blink. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I did, sprinting through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks, my lungs burning, my heart hammering. I reached the road finally, the sun high enough to reveal signs of civilization. My hands were scraped, my clothes torn, but I could see a small gas station in the distance. I ran the last stretch and practically threw myself inside, gasping for air. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I told him I needed a phone, a ride, anything. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. After calling the police and explaining the situation, I returned to the cabin with them later that day. They searched the area thoroughly and found evidence that someone had been living in the woods nearby, a small hidden campsite, signs of fires, discarded food, and makeshift shelters. It became clear that the noises, the scratches, the shadow at the window had all been a person watching the cabin, maybe even planning something. But when the police looked through the area, they couldn't find the person. It was as if they had disappeared into the forest without a trace. I didn't go back to the cabin after that. I learned something important that day: fear isn't always about the supernatural. It can be about being exposed, vulnerable, and watched in a place where you feel alone. I stayed in the city for a while after, hesitant to go anywhere remote, always double-checking locks, doors, and the shadows around me. Over time I got stronger. I started hiking again, but I never went out at night alone, and I always made sure someone knew where I was going. Looking back, the cabin taught me a lesson I can't forget. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that scared me, it was the very real fact that someone else could be out there, watching, waiting, while I was trapped in a place with no way to call for help. The experience left marks on me, not visible scars, but lessons ingrained in my instincts. I learned how to move silently, how to stay alert, and most importantly, how to trust my gut. That cabin in the woods might have been abandoned, but the fear it triggered was very real, and it changed me forever. Eventually, I returned to nature, but differently. I prepared more, I observed more, and I respected the unknown in the real world, the unknown of other people, the isolation, and the power of being completely alone in a place where help is hours away. I never forgot that feeling of being watched, the chill of realizing I was vulnerable, and the relief that came when I finally made it back to safety. The woods are beautiful, but they are not forgiving. And that lesson, learned in the quiet terror of a single night in a tiny cabin, stayed with me for life. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless notifications on my phone. I booked a small cabin in the middle of a dense forest, far from any main road, thinking it would be the perfect place to rest and write. It was a modest wooden structure, 2 stories, with a small loft, a little fireplace, and a porch that overlooked a clearing. The pictures online made it look cozy, almost inviting, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of being alone there. The drive out had been long, twisting along roads that became narrower and rougher the further I went. The forest grew denser, the trees taller and thicker, blocking out the sky in patches. When I finally arrived, the cabin seemed smaller than it looked online, more isolated than I expected. The air smelled sharp and earthy, damp from a recent rain, and the silence pressed in around me, heavy and tangible. I parked my car, unloaded my bags, and unlocked the creaking door. Inside, it smelled of dust, old wood, and faintly of mildew. I set my things down and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been growing since the moment I turned off the main road. The first evening was quiet, almost peaceful. I lit the fireplace, made a cup of tea, and sat on the worn couch with a notebook in my lap, trying to lose myself in words. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds I wasn't used to: the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the occasional distant cry of a bird. I reminded myself it was natural, nothing more. Yet when I looked out the window, the shadows cast by the trees seemed deeper than they should have been, like something could be moving between them. By nightfall, the isolation started to feel heavier. I had no cell signal, no way to check the time, and the only light came from the fireplace and a few dim lamps. The wind picked up outside, making the cabin moan and shudder. I convinced myself it was nothing, just the old wood reacting to the cold night air. But when I went to check the front door, it felt off. The latch was still in place, but the door wasn't as firmly shut as it should have been. I slammed it again and locked it, my heart starting to beat faster. I tried to sleep, but every creak, every groan of the house made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like something was dragging itself across the wooden porch outside. My first instinct was to tell myself it was a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound moved, deliberate, from one side of the cabin to the other. I stayed frozen, listening, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Hours passed like this. Every sound was magnified. A snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote, it all made me flinch. I didn't sleep that night, sitting by the fire with a blanket around me, listening to the forest. By morning I was exhausted, my nerves raw. I decided to explore the area, hoping movement would calm me down. The forest was thick with uneven ground and tangled roots. I followed a narrow path that led to a small creek. Sunlight filtered through the trees, giving the place a gentle, almost serene feeling. I told myself that the forest wasn't dangerous. It was just unfamiliar. That afternoon, I went back to the cabin trying to focus on writing, but the unease never fully left. That night was worse. I had hung a lantern by the door and kept a small axe nearby just in case. Around 10 p.m. I heard the scraping sound again. This time it was accompanied by something heavier, like footsteps landing on the porch with careful but forceful weight. I pressed myself against the wall, holding the axe in my trembling hands, waiting, listening. The steps stopped. Silence. Then a sudden loud thump on the window beside the front door made my heart leap into my throat. I couldn't see anything outside, the night was too dark, but the sound was close, too close. I didn't know what to do. I considered running, but my car was a 10-minute walk down a narrow, unlit path. I stayed inside, barricading the door with the couch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the axe. The sounds continued sporadically for hours, scraping, thumping, shifting noises on the porch. Every time I thought it had stopped, it would start again. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for the first hint of sunlight, listening for any sign of movement. When the sun finally rose, I carefully unbarricaded the door and stepped outside. The porch was a mess. Leaves and dirt were scattered everywhere. One of the lanterns I had left outside was knocked over, and the wood near the window was scratched and chipped, as if something had tried to get in. I wanted to run back inside, but I forced myself to stay calm. Whoever or whatever had been outside didn't seem to have actually entered the cabin, which was some small comfort. I spent the rest of the day securing the cabin as best I could. I reinforced the doors, moved furniture in front of the windows, and made sure I had a way to escape if necessary. I stayed on edge, constantly checking the perimeter, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. I realized I couldn't stay here another night. I planned my escape carefully. As the sun began to set, I packed only what I could carry, leaving behind most of my things. I had a backpack with water, food, my phone, still no signal, and a few essentials. I stayed low, moving quietly through the trees, sticking to areas where I could see the ground clearly and avoiding shadows where someone could hide. Every rustle of leaves, Every cracking branch made me freeze, but I kept moving, keeping my focus on the faint outline of the road I had driven on. It took hours to reach the road. I stayed off the main path until I could see my car, parked exactly where I had left it. Relief washed over me like nothing I had ever felt before. I got inside, locked the doors, and kept the engine running, scanning the tree line as I prepared to drive away. The forest felt alive behind me like it was watching, but I didn't care. I turned onto the road, driving fast but cautiously, until I finally reached a small gas station where I could call someone. The police arrived later that day. They checked the cabin, found the scratches on the door and window, and told me it looked like someone had been trying to break in but had fled before I arrived. There was no sign of who it was and no evidence beyond the damage and the tracks in the dirt. I left the forest behind that day, my heart still racing every time I thought about it, but at least I was safe. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was. The cabin had seemed like a peaceful escape, but it turned into a test of nerves and survival. I learned that isolation can be deceiving, that danger doesn't need to be supernatural to be terrifying, and that trusting your instincts can be the difference between safety and harm. I never went back to that forest, and I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. But I also learned that fear, no matter how consuming, can be faced and overcome, and that careful planning and courage can carry you through even the most frightening situations. I still think about that night, the sounds on the porch, the way the shadows moved, and the raw, unrelenting tension that filled the cabin. But I also think about the feeling of relief when I finally reached the road, the sense of accomplishment when I made it out unharmed. That experience changed me. It made me more cautious, yes, but it also made me stronger, more aware of the world around me, and more determined to respect both the beauty and the danger that can exist in the quietest places.